I'm joined now by California gubernatorial candidate Katie Porter. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's great to be here.
Well, congratulations on your announcement. And so as we enter this period, we have obviously seen Governor Newsom just a few days ago announce that he is suing the Trump administration over their imposition of tariffs. And so I'm curious, as you move forward with your run for governor, how do you view California as best positioned to fight against the Trump administration or not fight against the Trump administration?
Well, as the largest state, California is going to bear a lot of the consequences, and they're going to be sizable here. For example, if Congress follows through on cutting Medicaid funding, that would have a devastating effect on California. California is also a big part of the engine of the entire country's economy, and so Trump's tariffs are going to damage California's economy, therefore the entire United States economy. So I think when we see California push back on Donald Trump's harmful ideas, it's not just California that we're fighting for, it's actually fighting for the entire country. There is no doubt that a lot of what Trump is doing is going to make life more expensive for everyday Californians. And I think a big part of this governor's race is understanding that bringing costs down for everyday Americans, what we heard was really, really important to people in the 2024 election, and standing up to Donald Trump are one and the same now, because what he's doing is driving up costs.
Well, look, I think that there has been a big sense of fight among a raft of people, either in the federal government or in the states, against this administration. What we've also seen from Democrats for the better part of a decade is that there is asymmetric warfare happening with this administration, where we will move forward with the tools that have historically been at our disposal, and the Trump administration moves forward with tools that they concoct out of thin air. And so it always does feel like Democrats are fighting a different game, or bringing a knife to a gunfight, whatever analogy you want to use. And so with that in mind, how does that inform how you perceive the fight ahead, knowing that really the Trump administration doesn't view themselves as being bound by any sense of law, or certainly not norms or anything like that?
Yeah, so we're obviously going to see some of those Trump actions be challenged in court, as we should, because they're unlawful. And our California Attorney General Rob Bonta has been at the fore of a lot of those lawsuits. And I'm grateful that he's going to run for re-election here in 2026 and hopefully continue in that role. But I have thought a lot about what you say about Democrats being sometimes very slow, very deliberate, very bound by process, to the point where at the end of several years of leadership, what have we done? Voters want to know. And so I'm thinking about a particular moment, actually, where I think I was able to cut through that, consistent with respect for the law. So during the COVID pandemic, 2 months in, or a month in, we had a hearing with the CDC director. And there was an existing statute already on the books, existing law that provided that the CDC director could make testing, treatment, and other things for free in a public health emergency. And I pushed in that questioning and got the CDC director to commit to making testing free. Recently, I was talking to someone who was on the COVID task force at that time, and she said when I got the CDC director to use the existing law, while Americans felt really relieved and happy to know the government was doing something and testing was going to be free, some of the people on the government were sort of panicked. How do we do that? Where's the rules? We haven't investigated this yet. So my getting the CDC director to caused them to work quickly and to lean into the existing law in the moment. So I think there's a lot of areas in which Democrats need to be willing to rethink whether long-standing laws are doing what they're supposed to be doing. We're seeing this play out with some of our environmental laws here in California that aren't protecting the environment. They're just being used to slow down things that we desperately need, like transportation and housing.
Right. And so I want to get into that a little bit about this idea of getting to yes. And obviously the Ezra Klein abundance discourse has been very prevalent here in California. And he spoke in his book a lot about how the existing environmental laws are actually an obstacle to the very forms of transportation that would ultimately be better for the government more broadly, because they would allow for high-speed rail, for example. And so I'm curious, when you look at that kind of thing, which is, this pie-in-the-sky idea. I mean, I say pie in the sky, but it's not like all of these other countries don't already have high-speed rail. But I guess for us, it's this pie-in-the-sky idea where we have high-speed rail going from Los Angeles to San Francisco. That gets whittled down from Merced to Bakersfield, which is, the sprawling metropolises of Merced to Bakersfield. And so, and even now, I mean, who knows? At this point, obviously, it's normal to have a healthy dose of skepticism as to whether even that will get done. And so I'm curious, as you look forward, how you view California's place as being able to actually get things done so that it can serve as some type of a test case for people around the country to know that it's not enough to just elect Democrats because they are not Republicans, but to elect Democrats because we're capable of governing and building big things and dreaming up these big ideas and not just getting bogged down in with the intricacies of our own bureaucratic red tape.
Yeah, so look, I think this is where oversight in part comes in, something I'm known for. That was a big passion of mine in Congress, and I thought it was something Democrats could have done more of, not just when Republicans were in the White House or when Republicans were in the majority, but all of the time. Part of believing that government can accomplish things for good is being willing to do the oversight to make sure it's actually happening. And if it's not, being willing to make changes so it does. First, let me say that our Central Valley, cities like Bakersfield, there are almost 500,000 people. The Central Valley is a hugely important part of California and is the home to so many of our important industries, including agriculture, but also increasingly some of our green energy. And so having that transportation corridor all the way from Los Angeles to San Francisco, hopefully we can get it down through Orange County and San Diego someday, is really, really important. But it is taking too long. And what that does ultimately is drive skepticism about whether or not the things that we're paying for, the things that we believe in, can actually happen. And I think the point I take from Ezra's book is that the things that Democrats have done, the great things that governments, Republican and Democrat, have done, have required an urgency and a commitment to outcome, not just a process that we sometimes are lacking. So look, Trump is threatening to take away the federal funding for high-speed rail. It's another example of an attack on California. We should fight to get that funding. But we also need to have a governor who's going to hold everyone accountable to get that project done on time and on budget. That reality is that has not been the case. And so if we're going to build political will for the things that we believe in, whether that's environmental things, green energy projects, transit, more housing, after school care, then we have to make sure that we're getting them done quickly. And I think a lot about the Biden administration with this and the Inflation Reduction Act. Some pieces of that rolled out really quickly, right? Like the grants to chip manufacturers. Right. Other pieces, like the rebates that people were supposed to be eligible for, administered through the states when they bought home energy appliances. Not one of those programs, not one of the 50 states rolled their program out, to the best of my knowledge, before Biden was out of office. That's too slow. And so I do think sometimes Democrats get too into being administratively process perfect, exactly fair, balancing every single possible equity and concern at the expense of delivering for people. And I do think that that's an important point, and we have to keep that in mind as we lead forward. Democrats need to have our Democratic states and our Democratic cities be centers of excellent government, because that is going to be part of our reputation and our ability to win in swing areas, whether it's here in those Democratic states like Orange County or swing states in New York, or whether it's across the country where we can win in Republican states.
Let's talk about wildfires, because that's something that any governor will inevitably face during their time in office in California. And so I have two questions here. One is, what is your plan to deal with wildfires in a way that is different from the way that we're currently dealing with them? And second is, as we begin this rebuilding process, a lot of, and this kind of goes to the question we were just talking about, but a lot of the red tape and processes that are currently on the books that make building housing slower in California were discarded in deference to speed with the rebuilding process in the Pacific Palisades, for example. And so is there a world in which that can be a more across-the-board tool that we can use to promote building housing in LA and across the state more broadly?
Yeah, so with regard to wildfires, look, some of this comes from climate change. We know that, and we have an administration that's going to take us back on those efforts. But we also need to make our utility providers, make them spend the money to invest in wildfire prevention. That means putting more of the electrical lines underground. That means doing the maintenance that can help prevent it. It means having early warning and detection systems. And so utilities and their shareholders need to bear those costs, not customers, not taxpayers, but utilities and their shareholders. They've reaped the profits of providing electricity, and they need to bear the costs of doing that. That cost includes wildfire prevention.
Let me interrupt just to ask a quick question on that. What if they just altogether decide it's not the juice isn't worth the squeeze, and they're just going to pull out of, and they want to just pull out of the state entirely? We've seen insurance companies, for example, refuse to even offer their services in places like Florida.
Yeah, so look, I think utilities are a little different than insurance companies because of the amount of infrastructure that they own and have. So it's not as easy to pick up and cart off. But of course, we want utilities to be able to make a profit here. They're not going to provide this service if they don't make a profit. That's why we have regulation about utility costs. The question is, when we give those utilities their share of the profits and they have made profits, what are they doing with that money? They need to be reinvesting a portion of that profit into making sure that they can continue to operate successfully in the future, not just making sure that they're delivering short-term shareholder profits. That's true, by the way, for every business. We need to make sure businesses across the country are putting their money, their earnings, into creating the next generation of jobs and resources. The homeowners insurance challenge is going to be big, and the next governor of California is going to have to work on this. We need to make sure that we can make it profitable for homeowners insurance companies to be here. How are we going to do that without raising rates? Because Californians can ill afford higher expenses right now. And so this is something where we're working on thinking about concepts of reinsurance, making sure there are backstops. One of the problems with fire is it's very, very regional, very, very geographically intensive. And so we need to be able to spread that risk. And I think the state can be part of figuring out how we can do that. On your last point about rebuilding in the Palisades, rethinking the kinds of procedures that we use when we require housing. Yes, we are seeing not just when there's been a wildfire, but also efforts in our state legislature to try to make it faster to build housing, infill housing, for example, exempting that from some kinds of environmental review, some kinds of permitting. I think we need to be pursuing that across the state for all kinds of housing. We need workforce housing here in California. We need housing for our college students desperately. We need housing for our aging population. And so I do think we need to figure out how we're going to build that housing. Part of that is about supply and building more and bringing price down. And part of it is about public investment in making the cost of building cheaper. That could be through things like incentivizing the use of more modern materials, building housing that's going to use less electricity, making investments in the utility structures that housing needs to bring down the ultimate cost. So it's not an ideological issue. We are seeing progressives and environmental champions push for the faster building of housing and for just examining whether our environmental laws are actually serving their purpose.
Can I ask why we don't have housing being built right now? There is obviously a major demand, at least from my city where I live in Los Angeles. There's a major demand for housing. There has been an exodus out of the state of folks who simply can't afford housing as it stands right now. And so that would lend itself to reason that if it was built, people would move into it. And so what's stopping the housing from being built right now?
So there are a number of things. One is that land is scarce near the urban cities where people generally want to live, where the jobs are. One of the solutions to that is to permit more infill housing, to rethink some of our zoning, to permit, for example, accessory dwelling units in backyards, to think about whether we can make modest rezoning that might permit a building that, is 3 stories tall instead of 2 stories tall, whether we can limit the number of parking spaces that we mandate in places that have public transportation and are well suited for it. So some of this is about what we've already seen Governor Newsom do, which is hold cities that are refusing to build their share of housing, particularly affordable housing, to account. We have seen the state of California sue to try to enforce that. But we also need to think about how can the state be affirmatively bring down costs. We could think about using state land, providing that land, for example, as a land trust, to build housing on. The state would own the land. People could buy the properties, the condo units, the apartment units, the townhomes. That's one idea. But the other is the time and delay that it takes to get through the permitting process. When builders go to build a project, they have to commit that money up front. 3 years later, the costs of the materials have skyrocketed, and that's going to be so much more true.
And that's to say nothing of the carrying costs for all the time that they're waiting to get those permits handed down and whatever it may be.
Right. That's all the time value of money that they're carrying, and then the materials get more expensive, the labor gets more expensive, ultimately the housing gets more expensive. And so we can build expensive housing in California. What we're struggling with is building housing for our workforce, for our future generations, and that's where we need to be focusing.
I do want to ask a question that I spoke with Governor Newsom about just last week, and that was the idea of how do we restore our film industry here in Los Angeles. That was the lifeblood of LA. I've been here for 15 years. I have watched the film industry go from bustling to basically a shell of its former self as we've lost the industry to other states like Atlanta. Georgia has a major film industry. New Mexico, Louisiana, New York, Vancouver and Toronto have taken up a ton of our business, and I've watched my own friends who are not just actors in the industry, but also work behind the scenes. They're cinematographers and PAs and writers, all of whom have watched this industry leave. And so it's not just, the stars who are watching the industry go away. It's the folks who make the whole town run. And then who go into restaurants and buy housing here. It's this whole ecosystem. It's this whole trickle-down ecosystem that relies on having a healthy film industry. And that's basically been completely gutted. And so is the restoration of California, of LA's film industry, a priority of yours? And what steps will you take to ensure that it comes back in a healthy form for the 21st century, for the moment that we're living in right now?
Well, it's incredibly important to make sure California has a strong economy. And what I mean by a strong economy is that we have good, high-paying jobs in industries that are going to continue to grow and be important. And certainly the entertainment industry, Hollywood, those are important things. I think we have to recognize what you really illustrated is something that I think sometimes California has wanted to have this idea of California exceptionalism. We're the fifth biggest economy. We're so big. We're so special. The reality is we are in competition. We are in competition for jobs with other states. We are in competition for jobs with other countries. And we can, because of our resources, because of our human resources, the amazing people who live here, our natural resources, our location, and our history, our culture of innovation, we can win those competitions. But we have to see them, and we have to decide that we are going to make this a top priority. I think the governor is focusing on that now. I think that we have to make sure that if we're going to do things to create those jobs, that we're building in mechanisms to make sure those programs are actually going to create jobs, right? They're not going just to line the pockets of people at the top, but those kinds of programs are actually delivering. So we need to make investments in growing our economy here in California, and certainly the entertainment industry has to be part of that.
Would you commit to making sure that really the name of the game in the film industry, in the TV and film industry, is the size of the tax credit that a state is offering? That's what's allowed places like Georgia and Canada to really grab hold of the industry that used to reside here. Would you commit to making sure that California's film tax credits are competitive, if not more, than what we're seeing from other states and countries that are competing with us?
Well, as I said, we certainly have to make sure California is recognizing there's a competition and that we are winning that competition. Tax credits are a piece of it, and I know the legislature is right now going through the process of looking at how we've done our tax credits, not only at the size of them, but about whether they're creating jobs, particularly jobs for entry-level people, for jobs that cannot be replaced by AI, jobs that are going to be there for the future. Because we very much want those people to live and to work in California. That's ultimately about having that. I do think we also have to recognize that some of the states where housing is cheaper, where the cost of living is cheaper, where there aren't labor laws, those are also things that come into play. And so I do think California, we can't have it be a race to the bottom. We have to be true to our values. But we also have to think about how can we make these projects pencil? Because ultimately, businesses are going to choose to be in California when it makes business sense to do so. And so we have to make sure that we're providing the kinds of cost of living, making sure we're providing the kinds of tax credits, the kinds of investments in the pipeline of workers in the industry that are going to keep those businesses here and bring them back, hopefully.
And finally, let's finish off with this. I usually don't give a shit about horse race politics, but I am curious how the potential entrance of Kamala Harris, if she does decide to run for governor, how that would impact your campaign, or if it would have no impact on your campaign at all.
Yeah, look, I mean, Vice President Harris is going to be a tremendous factor of force in whatever she chooses to do next. And so she hasn't made her decision yet, whether she's going to return to national politics, whether she's going to run for governor, whether she's going to do something else. I'm very confident knowing her well that she's going to be a tremendous force for good in whatever she chooses to do. I think if she enters this race, given her name recognition, given her history of being our attorney general, she would be a formidable candidate. I think every candidate, including me, is going to have to be aware of what that name recognition, what that fundraising potential is. That said, I am doing everything I can to make sure that I am centering on winning this campaign. She has not entered the race. She's not made a decision. And she said it may be many months until she does so. In the meantime, Californians are very, very eager to think about what do we need to do to withstand Donald Trump? What do we need to do to bring down costs? And our governor's going to have a huge role to play in that. I think everyone is seeing how much states are going to absorb and have to react to the brunt of what Trump does, how much our states are going to be there to kind of buoy us up, both in terms of values, but also in terms of actual social services and support. So I think people are eager to begin talking to their future governor, to begin hearing their ideas. I'm certainly benefiting from having had this time to listen to people, to meet with people, to tour businesses, to listen to workers, to nonprofits. And so I'm going to make every bit of use of this time all the way through the primary, which is about 13 months from now in June, to make sure that I'm raising the resources and earning the votes and trust of Californians.
Okay, so with all of that said, how can my viewers right now and listeners help your campaign?
Well, I would love to have people join our team. They can do that at katieporter.com. They can follow us at social media at katieporteroc. I'm really excited to have a Substack called Beyond the Whiteboard, in which I'm putting together and putting out policy ideas to help California. Right now, our campaign is working hard to build the resources it's going to take to communicate in this big state. And so I hope everybody can sign up, can chip in what they can. It would really mean a lot.
Great. Well, I'll put that link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I appreciate you getting into the weeds with me on these issues, and I appreciate your time today. Katie Porter, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.